He slid the divorce papers across the marble table like he was tipping a waitress he didn't respect, didn't say her name, didn't look her in the eye, just flicked his wrist. The same hand she'd held at his mother's funeral. The same hand she'd squeezed when he told her he was scared, and pushed those papers toward her like she was a problem he'd already solved. And standing in the doorway of her own bedroom, wearing her robe, with her coffee cup in her hand, was Vanessa. 20 years. They had 20 years between them. Imani didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't give either of them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She looked at the papers, then at Jae-min, then at the woman who used to call her every Sunday morning just to talk. And she said, very quietly, "You should have learned who built this empire before trying to take it from me. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you would have died for, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Because what Imani does next will change the way you think about silence, power, and exactly how much damage a woman can do when she decides to stop being patient." Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Imani did, you need to understand who she was before she had any reason to fight back. Imani Caldwell had a rule about airports. No matter how long the flight, no matter how exhausted she was, she never let herself look disheveled walking off a plane. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. She'd learned early that certain women got looked through in rooms where decisions were being made, and she'd spent the better part of her adult life refusing to be one of them. So she kept her back straight, her expression neutral, her coat pressed even after 11 hours in the air, and she walked through customs at Hartsfield-Jackson looking like exactly what she was, a woman who had just spent 10 days in Seoul closing a deal that 3 men before her had failed to close. She hadn't told Jae-min she was coming home early. She'd meant to. The thought crossed her mind twice on the flight. She'd even opened a text message and started typing. But something stopped her. Not suspicion. Not instinct. She'd tell you later that she was just tired, that she didn't want to make conversation, that she wanted to walk through her own front door and feel the quiet of the house before anyone knew she was there. She'd tell you that. But the truth was something she wasn't ready to name yet. The drive from the airport took 40 minutes on a good day. It took 55 that afternoon because of a construction bottleneck on I-285, and Imani sat in the back of the car looking at her phone without really seeing it. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, had sent 14 messages in the last hour about the Seoul contract. Signatures needed, formatting issues, a minor clause dispute with the Korean legal team that would require Imani's personal sign-off before midnight. Imani answered 3 of them and left the rest. Priya would manage. She always did. What Imani was actually thinking about was the painting above the fireplace in the study. It was a piece she'd commissioned 3 years ago from a painter out of New Orleans, a woman who worked in deep earth tones, raw umber and burnt sienna, and a particular shade of almost black that wasn't quite blue, and it hung in the center of the south wall of their study like an anchor point. Imani had chosen it herself, paid for it herself, argued with Jae-min for 6 weeks about whether it was too large for the room, and then ignored him when she decided she was right. That painting was the first thing she looked at every morning when she walked downstairs, and the last thing she thought about at night. She wanted to see it. That's all she wanted. To come home, to see her painting, to pour a glass of something cold and sit in a quiet house and breathe. She didn't get any of that. The first thing she noticed was the truck. Not 1 truck. 2. They were backed up against the east wing of the estate, their rear doors open, men in gray uniforms moving in and out with the careful efficiency of people being paid by the hour. Imani's driver pulled through the gate slowly, and she watched one of the men carry a lamp she recognized. A floor lamp from the sitting room off the master bedroom, bronze with a cream shade she'd ordered from a shop in Milan, and loaded onto the truck like it was nothing. She got out of the car before it had fully stopped. "Excuse me." Her voice was calm. It was always calm. "Whose authorization do you have to remove items from this property?" The man with the lamp looked at her without recognition. "Ma'am, we were contracted by the owner of the estate, Mr. Kong." "I am also the owner of this estate." He blinked. He had no idea what to do with that. He said, "I'm just doing what I was told, ma'am," and kept walking. Imani stood there for a moment in the driveway with her luggage behind her and 2 moving trucks in front of her, and the cold, clean feeling of a woman who has just realized that whatever she's about to find inside the house is going to be worse than the trucks. She went inside anyway. The foyer was wrong. She knew it the second she stepped through the door. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Nothing had been thrown, nothing was broken, but wrong in the way a room feels when the things that made it yours have been quietly and systematically removed. The table by the stairs where she kept a small ceramic dish, a piece she'd inherited from her mother, chipped on one side, so ordinary she sometimes forgot it was there, was gone. The dish and the table, both. In their place was a different table, sleeker, something she'd never chosen. She walked through the foyer into the hallway, past the sitting room, past the kitchen entrance, all the way to the study. The painting was gone. Not moved, not repositioned, gone. The wall was bare, a faint rectangular shadow where the canvas had protected the paint from light. And for a long moment, Imani stood in front of that empty wall and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger. The thing that comes before anger when you're a woman who has trained herself to think before she reacts. The recognition that she was standing inside a plan she hadn't known about, inside a decision that had already been made without her, and the decision was about her life. She heard laughter from upstairs. She recognized the laugh. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not what she saw when she opened the door, but the half second before she opened it, when she was standing in the hallway with her hand on the knob, and she heard that laugh and she knew exactly whose it was. 20 years, she knew every version of Vanessa's laugh. The polite one she used at business dinners. The real one that came out when she'd had 2 glasses of wine and someone said something genuinely funny. The nervous one. The mean one, which was rare, and which Vanessa always apologized for after. This was the comfortable one. The one that meant, I am completely at home here. Imani opened the door. Later, people would ask her what she felt in that moment. Friends. Her sister. The divorce attorney she'd fly in from Chicago 3 weeks later. They all asked some version of the same question, and Imani always gave them some version of the same answer. She said, clarity. Not peace, not calm, not numbness. Clarity. The specific surgical kind that comes when you've been half suspecting something for so long that seeing it confirmed doesn't break you open. It just closes something. Closes a door inside you that you'd been keeping ajar. Vanessa was wearing her robe, the dark green silk one with the embroidered hem, the one Imani had bought in Tokyo 2 years ago, the one she'd been looking for this morning in Seoul when she was packing and couldn't find it and assumed she'd left it in the laundry. Vanessa had her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, Imani's coffee cup, from the set they'd bought together at a market in Savannah on a girls' weekend when Vanessa was going through her divorce and needed to get out of the city. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, Imani's bed, with her legs crossed and her hair loose and her expression open in the way a person's face looks when they don't know they're about to be seen. And then the bathroom door opened and Jae-min walked out. He saw her. His face went through 3 things in about a second and a half. Recognition, calculation, and this was the part Imani would replay later, alone, in a hotel room she'd rent downtown. A very specific kind of relief. Like a man who had been waiting for a confrontation to start so he could get on with the business of surviving it. He wasn't ashamed. He was ready. Imani. He said her name like it was the beginning of a prepared statement. Vanessa made a sound, not a word. A sound, the kind a person makes when they've just walked into a wall they didn't see coming, except the wall was her own choices. I wasn't supposed to be home until tomorrow, Imani said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe because it was the only true thing she could think of that didn't feel like screaming. No. Jae-min moved to the far side of the room. He opened the drawer of the nightstand, her nightstand, on her side of the bed, and he took out a manila envelope. He held it for a moment like he was considering his words. Then he set it on the table between them. Since you're here, the attorneys have already reviewed this. It's straightforward. Imani looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. Divorce papers, he said. I know what's in an envelope from a law firm, Jae-min. This doesn't have to be difficult. He said it with the quiet authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no by someone he couldn't replace. Vanessa will be moving in. I'd prefer you were gone before that becomes public. There's a settlement offer inside. It's generous. Generous. She looked at the man she had married 12 years ago. The man whose mother she'd nursed through the last 6 months of her life, whose business partners she'd charmed, whose enemies she'd helped outmaneuver, whose empire, the word arrived in her mind like a stone dropping into water, whose empire she had spent the last decade quietly, methodically helping him build. And standing behind him, Vanessa, who still hadn't said a word, who was looking at Imani with an expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance and was somehow worse than either. Imani picked up the envelope. She turned it over in her hands once. She looked at the return address. She recognized the firm, one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Atlanta, known for an 80% success rate in high-asset cases, favored by clients who wanted to leave their spouses with as little as legally possible. She set the envelope back down. "You should have learned who built this empire," she said, "before trying to take it from me." Then she walked out of the room, and she did not slam the door, and she did not cry until she was in the car. She gave herself 12 minutes. That was how long it took to get off the estate property and onto the highway heading toward the city, and for 11 of those minutes she cried in a way she hadn't since her mother died. Ugly, honesty, first crying that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the specific, unbearable grief of losing something you didn't realize you'd been hoping was still real. She cried for the marriage, and then she cried for Vanessa, and then she cried for the version of herself that had trusted both of them. And then she stopped. Minute 12. She called Elias. Elias Mercer had been the family's financial advisor for longer than Imani had been in the family. He was 71 years old, had been married to the same woman for 44 years, played chess badly, and understood the architecture of Jae-min's financial empire better than anyone alive. He was also one of the 3 people on Earth Imani trusted without qualification. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm coming back early," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd made it steady. "I need to meet with you tomorrow, not at the office. Somewhere private." A pause. Elias Mercer had not survived 50 years in rooms full of powerful men by failing to hear what wasn't being said. "My home," he said. 8 in the morning. I'll have coffee." "Thank you." She hung up. Outside the car window, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did in the late afternoon. The light coming in sideways through the skyline, turning everything gold and a little brutal. Imani watched it and thought about the painting that was gone from her wall. She thought about her mother's photograph, which she hadn't checked for yet but already knew was missing. She thought about the lamp in the back of the moving truck and the ceramic dish, and the way Jae-min had held that envelope like he'd been rehearsing. He'd been planning this for a while. That was the thing that was beginning to arrive, slowly, the way cold water rises, beneath the grief. The understanding that this wasn't an affair that had spiraled into a decision. The moving trucks had been arranged, the attorneys had been retained, the settlement had been prepared. The staff had presumably been given instructions about her belongings. This had been organized, which meant it had been thought about. For a long time. While she was standing next to him, while she was traveling on behalf of the business they'd built together. While she was being, she understood now with almost biochemical certainty, completely useful and completely blind. She'd been managed. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time. But underneath it, something else was beginning to form. Something harder and quieter, and a great deal more dangerous than grief. She checked into a hotel downtown. She ordered room service and didn't eat it. She sat at the desk and opened her laptop and began making a list, not of what she felt, but of what she knew. What she owned, what she'd signed, what she'd built, what she had access to that Jae-min might have forgotten she had access to because he'd been so certain she would walk away quietly that he hadn't bothered to think about what she knew. She wrote for 3 hours. At some point after midnight, she looked up from the laptop at the dark window in the city outside and she thought, "He thinks this is over." And then she thought, "He has no idea it hasn't started yet." She closed the laptop. She lay down on top of the covers with her clothes still on. She stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would meet with Elias. Tomorrow, she would begin to understand exactly what Jae-min had been doing while she wasn't looking. And then, very carefully, very quietly, the way she did everything that actually mattered, Imani Caldwell would decide what she was going to do about it. Elias Mercer's house smelled like old paper and strong coffee, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to people who have learned not to waste words. He lived in a neighborhood in Buckhead that had been respectable in the 1980s and stayed that way through sheer refusal to change. The houses were large without being ostentatious. The lawns were maintained without being manicured. Elias had bought his house with the first real money he'd ever made, and he told Imani once, over dinner years ago, that he kept living there because it reminded him of what it felt like to want something and finally get it. She'd liked that about him. She'd liked a lot of things about Elias Mercer. She knocked at 7:58. He opened the door before she could knock twice, which meant he'd been watching for her car, which meant he was worried. Elias was a man who answered doors at a leisurely pace, unless something had already told him to hurry. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I slept 2 hours." "Come in." He had coffee ready. Real coffee, not the pod machine kind, ground and pressed the way he'd learned from his wife, who had died 4 years ago, and whose photograph sat on the mantel in the living room with a small potted orchid beside it, that Elias kept alive with what Imani suspected was a level of devoted attention he would never describe out loud. She sat at his kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and told him everything. She told it straight, no editorializing, in the same voice she used in boardrooms. Not because she wasn't feeling it, but because she'd found long ago that if she let herself feel it while she was talking, she'd lose the thread, and the thread was the only thing she had right now. She told him about the trucks, the missing painting, the door, Vanessa in her robe, Jae-min with the envelope, the prepared statement quality of everything he'd said. Elias listened without interrupting. He had a habit, when he was thinking hard, of pressing his thumb against the side of his coffee mug in a slow, rhythmic motion, and he did that now for almost everything she said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you say the attorneys were retained?" he asked. "The return address on the envelope, I looked it up last night. The firm was founded in 2003. They're known for high-asset divorce litigation. Aggressive, fast, known for hiding money in shell structures before the other party knows what's happening." Elias pressed his thumb against the mug. "Imani," he said her name carefully. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as a question, not an accusation. Ask. How closely have you been watching the accounts in the last 18 months? She looked at him. "I've been traveling Seoul, Lagos, Dubai, London. I've been out of the country for more than half of the last year and a half managing the expansion deals." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of." He got up from the table. He went to the study down the hall. She could hear him moving, the sound of a drawer opening, papers shifting, and he came back with a folder, not a thick one. Just a manila folder, the kind that looks ordinary until you open it. He set it on the table between them and didn't open it yet. 3 weeks ago, he said, sitting back down, I flagged something in the quarterly reconciliation. I told myself it was a clerical issue. Transfers between entities in the portfolio sometimes get miscategorized. It's not uncommon, and Jae-min has always run a complex structure. He paused. But I kept looking at it, and when you called last night, I came down here and I pulled everything I could access and I looked at it again. He opened the folder. The first page was a wire transfer summary. Imani had read enough of these in her life to parse the columns quickly. Date, source account, receiving account, amount. Her eyes moved down the rows and then stopped. That's the Pacific Holdings account, she said. Yes. Pacific Holdings was one of the family's legitimate real estate subsidiaries. Imani had co-signed its incorporation documents. Her signature was on its founding charter. That account isn't supposed to move more than operating expenses without dual authorization. My authorization. Correct, Elias said. Except that 4 months ago, a clause amendment was filed with the corporate secretary that reclassified certain asset transfers as routine operational decisions under sole executive authority. Imani looked up from the paper. Who filed the amendment? Jae-min's legal team. You were in Lagos. She looked back at the numbers. The transfers were large. Not so large as to trigger immediate external scrutiny, but cumulative. A slow drain, steady and deliberate. The financial equivalent of turning a faucet down just slightly so no one notices the water level dropping. Where did it go? She asked. Elias turned to the second page. A company called Meridian Crest Consulting, registered in Delaware 8 months ago. I've spent the last 6 hours trying to trace its beneficial ownership structure. And? It's layered. At least 3 levels of shell companies before you hit anything concrete. But the registered agent is a woman named Sandra Oh. He let the name sit there. Imani didn't recognize it. Who is she? That's what's interesting. Elias folded his hands on the table. He had the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis, honest, direct, and aware that honesty costs something. Sandra Oh is a paralegal. She works for a firm in Midtown Atlanta, a firm that represents, among other clients, a man named David Choi. The name landed. Imani set down her coffee cup. David Choi. She knew the name the way you know the name of a bad storm that passed through years ago and left damage you're still repairing. David Choi ran a rival organization, parallel to Jae-min's in structure, competitive in territory, and hostile in a cold, professional way that had never quite escalated into open conflict, because both men were too smart and too careful for that. There had been moments over the years, a meeting Imani had heard about secondhand, a disputed territory agreement, a contractor who'd apparently tried to play both sides, but it had always stayed cold, always managed. Jae-min is moving money toward someone connected to David Choi, she said. Toward, or possibly through. Elias opened the 3rd page. There are also outgoing payments from a separate account, one I only have partial visibility into, to 3 individuals whose names I don't recognize, all in the same 6-week window, all in cash-adjacent instruments, no invoices. No corresponding services in the operating record. Imani looked at the names. She didn't recognize them either. What does that tell you? She asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. Elias was quiet for a moment. It tells me this is not a man reorganizing his personal assets ahead of a divorce. What you're describing here, he touched the folder lightly, as if he didn't want to press too hard on it, is a man restructuring an entire operation, moving legitimate money into private hands, creating distance between himself and the organization, and doing it while you were occupied elsewhere. Imani sat with that. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, someone on the next street was starting a lawnmower, and the sound drifted in and then faded. He wasn't just cheating on me, she said. No. The affair was... She stopped. She had to restart. The affair was noise. Elias looked at her with the careful, tired eyes of a man who'd been thinking the same thing since midnight and hadn't wanted to be the first one to say it. I think, he said slowly, that you were meant to find out. Not yesterday. The timing was wrong. You came back early. But soon. The trucks. The papers. The scene. It was designed to be a confrontation that ended with you signing something and leaving. A woman who just discovered her husband and her best friend would be a woman in shock, in pain, desperate to get out and preserve what dignity she had left. He paused. That's a woman who doesn't read financial documents carefully. The lawnmower sound disappeared. Imani stared at the transfer summary for a long moment. He needed me gone, she said. Not just out of the marriage, out of the structure, removed from the authorization chains, out of the oversight positions. Before anyone noticed the money was moving. She closed the folder. She pushed it back toward him, but gently, because Elias had taken a risk pulling this together, and she understood the weight of that. I need everything you can access, she said. Every account you have any visibility into. Every amendment, every reclassification, every transfer in the last 2 years. I need to know the shape of it before I know what to do with it. Elias nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask the right question. I'll need a few days, he said. You have them. She stood up. He walked her to the door, and at the threshold she turned back. Elias, why didn't you call me when you first flagged the discrepancy? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the orchid on the mantel, the one he kept alive for his dead wife. And then he looked back at her with the expression of someone who knows they made an error and has already punished themselves sufficiently for it. Because I told myself I was wrong, he said. And because Jae-min is frightening, she said. Not as an accusation, as a fact. Yes, Elias said quietly. He is. She nodded once. So am I, she said, and she walked back to her car. She spent that day in the hotel, not grieving, working. She pulled up every entity she had a legal interest in, every account her name appeared on, every board she sat on, every contract she'd personally signed. She made a list on paper, actual paper, not her laptop, not her phone, Nothing that existed on a server somewhere that someone with the right connections could access. And she started mapping what was still hers and what had already been quietly moved beyond her reach. It took 9 hours. What she found at the end of those 9 hours was not what she expected. She'd expected damage. She'd expected Jae-min to have been strategic, methodical, careful. She'd expected to find a man who'd been systematically dismantling her position piece by piece. What she found instead was someone who'd been in a hurry. Whoever was moving the money, whatever timeline was driving it, they hadn't been as clean as they should have been. There were seams, overlaps, small inconsistencies in dates and document IDs that suggested rushed filings, corners cut, approvals obtained through channels that were legitimate on their face but would not survive hard scrutiny from someone who knew what to look for. And Imani knew what to look for, because she was the one who designed the system. On the third day, she made a phone call she'd been putting off. Not to her attorney, not to Elias, to Vanessa. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone in her hand for a full 4 minutes before she dialed, not because she was afraid of the conversation, but because she was genuinely uncertain what version of herself was going to walk into it. The part of her that was still grieving the friendship wanted something she couldn't name. Not an apology, or not just an apology. She wanted Vanessa to explain herself in a way that made the 20 years make sense, and she already knew that wasn't going to happen, because there's no explanation that does that. Vanessa picked up on the first ring. Imani. Her voice was a wreck, raw at the edges, like she'd been crying or hadn't been sleeping, or both. I'm not calling to fight, Imani said. I know. A pause. I wouldn't blame you if you were. Imani looked at the wall across from her. A generic hotel print, a landscape of somewhere that wasn't anywhere specific, water and sky in neutral colors chosen not to offend. How long? Imani asked. Silence on the other end. Long enough that Imani counted 7 seconds. 8 months, Vanessa said. 8 months. Imani repeated it without inflection. She'd told herself she was prepared for a number, and the number still went into her like something cold. While I was traveling. Yes. Vanessa's voice cracked on this word, and she controlled it. Imani, I need you to know that I don't need that right now. Imani cut her off, not harshly, cleanly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, and I know that's a strange thing to ask you right now, but I'm asking anyway. Another silence. Then, okay. Has Jae-min ever asked you to access files, financial documents, business records, anything from the organizational structure? Has he ever pointed you towards something and asked you to look at it or retrieve it or pass it to him? The silence this time was different. Not guilty silence, confused silence. Once. Vanessa's voice was careful now, feeling around the edges of something she didn't quite understand. He said you'd asked him to retrieve some contract files from the shared server, but you were traveling and he couldn't find the access credentials. He asked me if I could. She stopped. You have me as an authorized user on the communications archive, from the Lagos deal, 2 years ago. Imani remembered. She'd added Vanessa as a temporary authorized user during a period when she needed someone to receive and forward documents while Imani was in a 12-hour negotiation. She'd never removed the access because it had seemed trivial. A background administrative detail on a long list of background administrative details. Jae-min had known about it. Of course he had. What did you retrieve for him? Imani's voice was very quiet. It looked like an old contract file. The Legos vendor agreement. He said you needed it for a tax audit reference. Another pause. Longer now. Imani, what did I'm not sure yet, Imani said. But I need you to think carefully and tell me everything he's ever asked you to do. Not the big things, the small things, the things that seemed so ordinary you almost didn't register them. She heard Vanessa breathing on the other end of the phone. She heard the particular quality of someone beginning to understand the dimensions of a room they thought they knew. Can we meet? Vanessa asked. Not yet. Imani stood up from the bed and walked to the window. But when I ask you to, I need you to come. And I need you to bring everything, text messages, emails, anything he sent you, anything you retrieved or forwarded, everything. Imani. Vanessa's voice broke for real this time. Not performatively, privately. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. No, Imani agreed. It doesn't, She hung up. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the city, and she thought about what Elias had said. About how the affair was useful because it kept everyone focused on a broken marriage. She thought about Vanessa's voice when she said he asked me to retrieve it. She thought about how Vanessa had been so certain she knew what was happening, a man leaving his wife, choosing her instead, when what was actually happening was something she was standing inside without being able to see the shape of it. Jae-min had used Vanessa to access information, which meant Vanessa was not the woman he was choosing. Vanessa was a resource he was utilizing, and when the divorce was finalized and the money was moved and the restructuring was complete, a resource you no longer need is a resource you discard. Imani wasn't sure whether to feel sorry for Vanessa or not. She decided the feeling could wait. There were more important things. By the end of the first week, she had a clearer picture. Jae-min was moving money, and he was moving it fast, which meant something was pushing him, a deadline or a threat or an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. The payments to the 3 unidentified individuals that Elias had flagged weren't random. When she finally traced the corporate filings associated with 2 of the names, they both connected to entities that overlapped with David Choi's territory. Not directly, nothing so obvious, but close enough when you knew what you were looking at. He wasn't just restructuring, he was making a deal. And then Elias called her on a Thursday morning, and the way he said Imani when she picked up made her chest tighten before he'd said anything else. "I found something," he said. "I need you to come back to the house." She was there in 40 minutes. Elias was standing at his kitchen table when she arrived, not sitting, which meant he'd been pacing. The folder from before was open in the center of the table, and beside it were 3 more folders, and a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting, dense, small, the handwriting of a man writing faster than usual. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me." "Sit down, Imani." She sat. He picked up the legal pad. He didn't read from it. He looked at her directly, the way a person looks at you when they're not going to soften what comes next. "Jae-min has been selling information," he said, "specifically operational information about the organization's structure, its contacts, its legitimate business network. The kind of information that would be extraordinarily valuable to a competitor who wanted to move into the same market without building relationships from scratch." Imani's jaw tightened. "To Choi. That's my working assumption. The shell company structure leads toward his territory. But there's something else." Elias set down the pad. He picked up the top folder. 2 months ago, a protected server that carries internal communications for 3 of the legitimate subsidiary companies was accessed from an external device. The access was authorized by a user credential that belongs to you. She stared at him. "I was in Dubai 2 months ago." "I know." His voice was heavy with it. "The access log shows your credentials, but the IP address of the access point traces back to an internet service account registered to a residential address here in Atlanta." She thought of Vanessa. She thought of the authorized user access she'd never removed. She thought of Jae-min asking Vanessa, so casually, to retrieve just a small thing, just a file, just something Imani had asked for. "He used my access credentials," she said, "through Vanessa. He went into the server under my authorization and pulled the operational files. And if anyone ever investigated the breach, it would look like I did it." Elias picked up the legal pad again. He held it and then put it down again, like he couldn't decide whether to read from it or just say the worst part out loud. He just said it. "There's a payment trail," he said, "that I believe is constructed to suggest you received compensation for the breach. A series of deposits into an account in your name, an account I had no knowledge of, and that you may not have known existed." Imani sat very still. "He was going to frame me," she said. Not a question. Not yet shock. Just a woman sitting at a table processing the architecture of what had been built around her while she was out of the country working. "The divorce would remove you from the organizational structure," Elias said. "And if during the divorce proceedings, or after, it came to light that you had allegedly sold confidential information to a rival, the settlement, the credibility, the ability to contest anything, all of it would collapse. You would be the problem. You would be the reason the organization was compromised, and he would be the victim of a wife who turned on him." She was quiet for a long time. Elias sat down across from her. He looked like a man who was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. "How far along is it?" she asked. "The setup." "Far enough," he said. The account in your name has been active for 3 months. The deposits are small but consistent. If the right person started asking the right questions, it would hold up long enough to destroy me, she said. Even if it eventually came apart, the damage would be done. She looked down at the table, then up. He really did think of everything. He thought of quite a lot, Elias said carefully, but he didn't think of you. Elias almost smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. No, he said. He didn't. Imani stood up from the table. She wasn't panicking. That was the thing about this moment that she would struggle to explain later. She wasn't panicking. The panic was somewhere underneath, sure, a cold structural thing like water under ice. But on the surface, she was very calm and very focused, because she'd crossed a line inside herself and she could feel it. This wasn't about the affair anymore. This wasn't about Vanessa, or the missing painting, or the green silk robe, or the 12 years of a marriage that had apparently been something other than what she'd thought it was. This was about the fact that a man had spent months constructing a trap designed to take everything from her and leave her holding the blame for her own destruction. And she had walked into his house before it was ready. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "Copy everything," she said. "Every document, every transfer record, every access log. I want it encrypted and I want it stored somewhere he has no reach into." "Already done," Elias said. "Last night." She looked at him. 71 years old, bad at chess, careful with orchids. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not as a challenge, genuinely. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I watched you build half of what he's trying to take," he said. "And because I'm old enough to know that the difference between a man who has power and a man who deserves it is whether the people around him choose to keep showing up." He paused. "I'm not showing up for him anymore." She nodded. She walked to the door. "Imani." His voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. Not because I think you'll fail, because the people who'll be caught in the middle of this aren't all guilty." She thought about the staff Jae-min had removed from the estate. She thought about the employees in the legitimate subsidiaries, the ones who came in every day and did their work, and had no idea what the man whose name was on the building was doing with the structure they worked inside. "I know," she said. She stepped out into the morning. The sun was already high and sharp, the kind of Atlanta heat that arrives without warning and presses down on everything. And Imani stood on Elias's porch for exactly 4 seconds, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Jae-min had built a trap. He'd used her best friend to access her own credentials. He'd constructed a financial fiction designed to make her look like a traitor. He had been, for months, carefully and methodically building the case for her destruction while she was building deals in foreign cities on behalf of the empire he was preparing to hollow out. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and she didn't start the engine. She held the steering wheel with both hands, and she looked at the street ahead of her, quiet and ordinary. A Tuesday morning in Buckhead with sprinklers on and a neighbor's cat sitting in a driveway, and absolutely no indication that anything in the world had just fundamentally changed. She thought, he wanted me gone before the structure moved. She thought, he needed me blamed if anyone came looking. She thought, he used Vanessa as a tool, and he used me as a scapegoat, and he used 12 years of marriage as cover, and he genuinely believed I would sign the papers and leave quietly, and it would all be over. And then she thought, very clearly, with a kind of cold and absolute precision she hadn't felt before this moment, I am not leaving quietly. I am not leaving at all. Not until every single thing he has hidden is standing in the light. She started the engine. She pulled out of the driveway. She drove back toward the city, and she was already working, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already beginning to understand that the woman Jae-min had been so confident she was, the wife who would be too hurt, too humiliated, too focused on her own grief to look sideways. That woman had stepped out of the story the moment she walked through his bedroom door. What was driving back toward Atlanta now was something else entirely. And Jae-min had no idea she was coming. She had a system. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of thing she could explain to anyone without sounding paranoid, and she was aware of that. But paranoia is just pattern recognition that arrived ahead of the evidence, and the evidence had arrived, so she worked the system anyway. Every morning at 6, she sat at the desk in the hotel room with the blackout curtains still drawn, and she reviewed what Elias had sent the night before. Encrypted files forwarded through a private server he'd set up using equipment his nephew had helped him configure. Because Elias Mercer, at 71, had decided that the moment for trusting conventional channels had passed. Every morning, she cross-referenced what she found against the corporate filing records she'd pulled from the Secretary of State database, against the property records she'd requested through a paralegal firm that had no connection to any entity Jae-min knew about, against the notes on the legal pad she kept locked in the hotel safe when she wasn't using it. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that required you to hold 20 things in your head simultaneously without letting any one of them bleed into the others. She'd always been good at that. Jae-min had called it coldness, early in their marriage, when she was processing something difficult, and he wanted her to react faster and louder. She'd never corrected him because the distinction between cold and controlled wasn't one she'd felt like explaining to a man who confused volume with strength. She was on her fourth morning of this when the call came. Not from Elias. From a number she didn't recognize, an Atlanta area code, no saved contact, nothing in her call history to suggest she should pick up. She stared at it for 2 rings and then answered because the alternative was sitting in a hotel room wondering. Ms. Caldwell. The voice was male, middle-aged, professional in a way that suggested the professionalism was a costume rather than a personality. My name is Raymond Cho. I'm an investigator with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Imani's hand tightened around the phone. About what? She asked, because she needed to hear him say it. About several transactions associated with a corporate account bearing your name and authorization signature, he said. Specifically, transactions that may relate to an ongoing investigation into the unauthorized transfer of proprietary business information. She looked at the wall in front of her, the generic landscape print, water and sky. I'd like to have my attorney present for any formal conversation, she said. Of course, he said. That's your right. I'd simply ask that you not wait too long. These things have a way of becoming more complicated when there's a delay. He left a number. She wrote it down on the legal pad. She hung up and sat for a full minute without moving, the phone in her lap, the yellow legal pad open in front of her with Raymond Cho's name and number at the bottom below 2 pages of financial notations. And she thought, he already moved. She'd assumed she had more time. She'd been wrong. Her attorney's name was Catherine Park, and she flew in from Chicago that afternoon. Catherine was 46 years old, Korean-American, with close-cropped hair, and the particular composure of a woman who had spent 20 years in rooms where people did not want her to succeed and had converted their resistance into fuel with such efficiency that she no longer noticed the conversion happening. She had a reputation for being difficult. Her clients called it something else. She arrived at the hotel at 4 in the afternoon and she sat across from Imani at the small table by the window and she read everything Imani had. The financial summaries from Elias, the property records, the corporate filing anomalies, the access logs. And she didn't say anything for a long time. When she did speak, her first question was, "Have you touched the account they're looking at?" "I didn't know it existed until 4 days ago." "Have you accessed it since you found out?" "No." "Good." Catherine closed the folder. "The account is in your name, but the question is whether your signature was forged on the opening documents or whether it was opened using a power of attorney or similar instrument. If it's a forgery, that's actually better for you. It's a cleaner case. If it was opened using an instrument you signed without understanding what you were signing, it gets more complicated." "I didn't sign anything authorizing a separate account." "People sign things they don't fully read, Imani. I need you to think back over the last 2 years. Any document Jae-min presented you with that was described as routine, administrative, a formality." Imani thought about it. 2 years. The volume of paperwork that moves through the operation of an organization that size, even the legitimate portions. She'd signed hundreds of documents, maybe more. Jae-min had always handled the initial preparation, always described things in general terms, always had his legal team summarize rather than showing her full documentation. She'd trusted the summaries because she'd been busy, because she'd been traveling, because she'd been building the deals that funded the structure she was apparently trusting too much. She felt sick. Not dramatically, quietly, the internal kind of sick that settles in the stomach and stays. "I don't know," she said. "Then we need to assume the worst and work backward," Catherine said. "The GBI contact. Don't call him back without me. Don't meet with him without me. If he approaches you directly, you say 2 words, 'My attorney,' nothing else." "Understood." Catherine leaned forward. I want you to understand something clearly. If Jae-min has constructed this the way it appears he hasn't just built a divorce strategy. He's built a criminal exposure strategy. He's positioned you to appear complicit in whatever investigation comes out of the information breach. The affair, the divorce, the emotional spectacle of it, all of that is the visible story. The financial structure is the real story. And if the GBI gets to the real story before we do, your ability to shape the narrative disappears. Imani looked at her. How much time do we have? Days, Catherine said. Maybe less. She called Vanessa that night. Not because she'd forgiven her, not because she trusted her, because Vanessa was the loose thread in Jae-min's construction and loose threads. When you pull them with the right amount of pressure at the right angle, have a tendency to unravel the whole garment. Vanessa picked up on the second ring again, the same as before, and Imani had a brief disorienting thought that Vanessa had been waiting for her calls, sitting with her phone close, hoping for a contact that felt like something other than what it was. I need to meet, Imani said. When? Tonight. A pause. Okay, there's a place. I'm not at the estate, I'm at my sister's in Decatur. There's a diner on Ponce, not a public place. Silence. Then, my sister's house. She'll give us the kitchen. Send me the address. Vanessa's sister Diane had the particular energy of a woman who had made her feelings about this situation extremely clear to her sister and was now compressing all of that into a tightly controlled hospitality. She let Imani in without a word, pointed toward the kitchen, and went upstairs in a way that said, I am removing myself from this without saying it. Vanessa was at the kitchen table when Imani walked in. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. She had the specific wrecked quality of someone who has been crying at intervals for days. Not constantly, but whenever the understanding resurfaces. Her hair was pulled back and she wasn't wearing any of her usual armor, no makeup, no jewelry, just a sweatshirt and the expression of a woman who has stopped pretending she's okay because there's no one left to pretend for. Imani sat down across from her. She put a folder on the table between them. Not everything, a selection. Enough to show Vanessa the shape of it. I need you to look at this, Imani said. Vanessa looked at the folder and then at Imani. What is it? The thing you didn't know you were part of. Vanessa opened it. She was quiet for a long time. She turned pages slowly, and Imani watched her face move through the material the way a face moves through something that starts as confusing and becomes, gradually, something worse than confusion. Her jaw tightened on the second page. Her breathing changed on the fourth. By the sixth, she'd stopped turning pages and was just staring at the transfer summary with her hands flat on the table. The server access, she said. Her voice was very low. The Lagos file I retrieved for him. He used your retrieval to cover a broader access event, Imani said. Your credentials touched the system. His actual pull went deeper. Operational contacts, financial routing information, 3 years of communication records. But the access log shows your touch point as the entry. You would look, to anyone auditing the system, like the authorized person who opened the door. Vanessa looked up. He told me it was for you. I know he did. I thought he was just handling something administrative, something you'd asked for. Her voice cracked and she pushed through it. Imani, I swear I didn't know what I was. I believe you. Imani said it flatly, not warmly, but directly. That's not the point right now. The point is that there is an account in my name that has been receiving money in connection with that breach. The GBI called me this morning. They want to talk. Vanessa went pale. Not figuratively. The color actually left her face, a rapid, visible drainage that made her look briefly like a different person. They're going to think you did it, Vanessa said. That's what the account is for, Imani said. Yes. He set you up. Vanessa said it slowly, like the sentence was a physical object she was turning over in her hands. He set you up using me. Imani didn't answer. She watched Vanessa arrive at the understanding on her own, because the understanding meant more if it arrived without being pushed. Vanessa stood up from the table abruptly. She walked to the sink and put both hands on the counter and stood there with her back to Imani and her shoulders rigid, and Imani heard her take a breath that was ragged at the edges and then controlled. What do you need from me? Vanessa said, not turning around. Everything, Imani said. Every text message, every email, Every phone call you can remember, every document you touched, every time he asked you to access anything, retrieve anything, forward anything. I need dates and I need specifics. Vanessa turned around. Her eyes were dry now. Something had changed in them. The grief was still there, but beneath it something harder had risen, the specific hardness of a woman who understands she has been used and is deciding what to do with that knowledge. He told me Vanessa was the future, she said. That's what he said to me. He said I was the one he'd been waiting for. He said that to keep you cooperative, Imani said. I know that now. Her voice was very quiet. I gave up 20 years of friendship for a man who was using me as a tool. Imani said nothing. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't be either cruel or falsely comforting, and she wasn't interested in either. I'll give you everything, Vanessa said. The everything took 3 hours to compile. Vanessa had saved more than Imani had expected. Text messages going back 8 months, emails, even voicemails she'd recorded on her phone by holding it up to the speaker. Not because she'd been suspicious, she explained, but because she was a person who documented things compulsively. She'd done the same thing in her own divorce, she said. Kept everything. It was a habit that had calcified into instinct. What emerged from the 3 hours of going through Vanessa's documentation was a timeline. A detailed, specific, and frankly meticulous timeline of requests that Jae-min had made over the course of 8 months, each one individually small, individually explainable, individually innocent. Taken together, they describe something else. A systematic, incremental harvesting of access points, credentials, documents, and communication records that, assembled, constituted a comprehensive intelligence package on the organization's legitimate operations. The kind of package that would be extraordinarily valuable to someone who wanted to absorb those operations from the outside. The kind of package a man building a deal with a rival organization would need. At 11:30, Imani photographed every page, encrypted the images, and forwarded them to Catherine. She left Vanessa with instructions: call no one, go nowhere public, keep her phone close, and she drove back to the hotel. It was on the drive back that it happened. She was on Ponce de Leon, stopped at a red light, when her phone buzzed with a text from Elias. The text was only 4 words. Call me. Not encrypted. She pulled into a gas station and called him. He picked up immediately. I found something, he said, and his voice was wrong. Not the careful, measured voice of their previous conversations, but something underneath it, something tighter. What is it? I need you to come here, he said. Tonight. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't... He stopped. There's something you need to see and I can't send it. Not digitally, I won't put this on a server. The tightness in his voice was something she hadn't heard before. Elias Mercer had spent 50 years in the company of dangerous people and difficult information and had built his entire professional identity on the quality of his unflappability. She had never once heard him sound like this. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. He met her at the door. He looked like the 20 minutes since his call had aged him. His shirt was untucked, which she had never seen, and he was holding a glass of something brown that she also had never seen, because Elias was a man who drank coffee and occasionally wine and had told her once that he'd given up bourbon when his wife got sick because he'd wanted to be clear-headed. He wasn't clear-headed now. Or rather, he was deeply, terribly clear-headed, but the clarity was costing him something. Come in, he said. Close the door. She did. She followed him to the study, where the desk was covered in printed documents. More than she'd seen before, pages spread in a pattern that suggested he'd been arranging and rearranging them, trying to find the layout that made the story they told bearable. He pointed at a chair. Sit. She sat. He picked up a single sheet from the left side of the desk and held it for a moment before handing it to her. It was a corporate registration document, Nevada filing, dated 14 months ago. The company name was Caldwell Strategic Partners, LLC. Her name. Her name was on the founding documents as the sole managing member. Her signature appeared at the bottom of 3 pages. Her social security number was in the personal information block. Her home address, the estate, was listed as the primary business address. She had never heard of this company. Keep going, Elias said. She turned to the second page. Bank account records for Caldwell Strategic Partners, LLC. 14 months of transactions. Regular incoming deposits, irregular outgoing transfers. The total in and out across 14 months was significant, well into 7 figures. Where did the income come from? She asked. Her voice was very steady. She was very specifically keeping it very steady. Sources that connect, when you trace them back far enough, to entities associated with David Choi's network, Elias said. She looked up. And the outgoing transfers? She asked. Several of them connect to accounts associated with the organization's internal operations. He picked up another page, including one payment, 8 months ago, that corresponds exactly in amount and timing to the disappearance of a sum from the Security Division's operational fund. She understood what she was looking at. Not just a frame, not just a constructed paper trail designed to make her look complicit in a financial breach. Something larger. He didn't just build an account to make me look like I sold information, she said. He built an entire company. He built 14 months of transaction history. He built a paper identity for me as an active participant in a financial relationship with a rival organization. She set the page down very carefully because if she didn't do it carefully, she might do something she'd regret. And the outgoing payments to the organization's own accounts make it look, Elias said, as if money from Choi's network was flowing into the organization through you, as if you were a conduit, as if you had been, for over a year, operating as a financial intermediary between your husband's organization and his primary competitor. That's not just divorce leverage, Imani said. No, Elias agreed. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. That's criminal exposure, federal level. If the GBI finds this company, or when they find it, because it is structured to be found, Imani, it is sitting there waiting to be found by the right investigation. What they find is not a woman who helped sell a few documents. What they find is a woman who has been running money between two criminal organizations for over a year. She sat very still. The study was quiet. The house was quiet. Outside, distantly, a car passed on the residential street. He was going to destroy me, she said, completely. Not just take the money. Not just take the organization. He was going to make sure I couldn't come back from it. That there was no version of this where I recovered, where I had credibility, where I could contest anything or challenge anything or testify against anything. Yes, Elias said, because if I could contest it, I could expose what he was actually doing. Yes. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the window of the study and looked out at the dark street and the ordinary quiet of it, and she felt something move through her. Not panic, not despair, but a kind of white-hot clarity that arrived in the body before it arrived in the mind. The feeling of standing at the edge of something with the ground already gone beneath 1 foot. He had not been building a divorce case. He had been building a destruction. 14 months of fabricated transaction history. A shell company in her name. Money trails designed to implicate her in a federal crime. A best friend positioned as an unwitting accessory whose actions could corroborate the frame if anyone pulled the thread. A GBI contact already made, which meant the investigation wasn't coming. It was already here. She turned back to the room. When was the company incorporated? She asked. Elias checked the page. 14 months ago. What was I doing 14 months ago? He looked at her. I was in Seoul, she said. The first Seoul trip. The preliminary negotiations for the deal I just closed. She pressed her hand flat against the windowsill. He started building this before I even left. He was planning this while I was standing next to him, while I was shaking hands at his business dinners and flying 15 hours to close deals that funded the structure he was building around me like a cage. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say. He's been running this for over a year, she said. The whole thing, the financial restructuring, the information transfer to Choi, the deal he's making, and the frame he's building around me to make sure that when it falls apart, if it falls apart, I'm the one left standing in the rubble. She picked up her bag from beside the chair. Elias. Her voice was different now. Not louder. Not harder. Simply different. The way a voice changes when a person stops processing and starts deciding. I need you to understand something. Everything changes tonight. What we've been doing, the careful documentation, the slow assembly of the picture. We're out of time for that. He looked at her steadily. What do you need? He asked. I need you to call every person you trust inside this organization, she said. Not the people who answer to Jae-min, the ones who answered to the work itself. The ones who remember what this structure was built to be before he started hollowing it out. I need you to tell them that the meeting they didn't know was coming is coming, and I need you to tell them it's coming from me." Elias was quiet for a moment. "When?" he asked. 72 hours, she said. "Before the GBI gets another step closer, before Jae-min finishes whatever he's closing with Choi, before the frame gets any more solid." She picked up her jacket. "And Elias, not a word to anyone outside of people you are absolutely certain of. If Jae-min finds out I know about the company before I'm ready to move, everything." "I understand," he said. She walked to the door of the study. She stopped in the doorway and turned back once, and she looked at Elias Mercer sitting at his desk with his untucked shirt and his unfinished bourbon, surrounded by the documents of a betrayal 14 months in the making, and she said, "He built this to make me disappear." Elias met her eyes. "I know," he said. "Then he built it wrong," she said, "because the one thing it did was show me exactly how far he was willing to go. And now I know what I'm dealing with." She walked out. She sat in her car in his driveway for 90 seconds. She did not cry. She sat with her hands on the wheel, and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way a person breathes when the emotion is real and enormous, and there is absolutely no time for it. Then she pulled out her phone, and she called Catherine Park. Catherine answered on the first ring. It was after midnight. "I need you to clear your calendar for the next 72 hours, Imani said. "Everything, whatever you had, move it." A pause. "How bad?" "He built a shell company in my name. 14 months of fabricated transaction history connecting me to a rival criminal organization. The GBI is already investigating, and the trail is constructed to lead straight to me." Silence on Catherine's end. Not shock. Catherine Park did not do shock, but the specific silence of a mind reorganizing its priorities at speed. "Where are you right now?" Catherine asked. "In my car." "Go back to the hotel. Don't use any of your regular accounts for anything. Don't make any calls from your personal number except to me and Elias. And Imani," Catherine paused, "you need to understand that fighting this changes everything. If we go forward, we are not managing a divorce. We are walking into a federal investigation and attempting to redirect it in real time. If we get it wrong, I know what happens if we get it wrong," Imani said. "Do you?" Catherine's voice was quiet, direct. "Because what Jae-min has built isn't just a trap. It's an invitation to overreact, to come out swinging before you're ready and hand him exactly the chaos he needs to complete his own exit. If you move too early, you lose everything. If you move too late, the GBI frame solidifies, and you lose everything differently." Imani stared through the windshield at Elias's quiet house and the ordinary dark street beyond it. "Then tell me," she said, "when we move." Catherine was quiet for a moment that was longer than a pause and shorter than deliberation. 72 hours, she said. And Imani thought, "I already know." She started the car. She drove back toward the city through the dark. And she was not the same woman who had driven to Elias's house an hour before. She was not the woman who had checked into a hotel 9 days ago with a grief she was rationing carefully so she could still function. She was not even the woman who had stood in her own bedroom doorway and looked at the two people who had betrayed her and found the words that would define everything that followed. She was something that had been constructed, slowly and without her consent, by a man who had spent 14 months deciding she was an obstacle and building the mechanism for her removal. And now she knew every bolt of it, which meant she knew exactly where to apply the pressure that would make the whole structure come apart. But only if she moved with a precision that left no margin, no hesitation, and no version of herself that was still waiting for this to hurt less before she was ready to act. The city opened up around her, lights and highway, and the vast, ordinary dark of 3 million people who had no idea any of this was happening. And Imani drove through the center of it toward the 72 hours that would determine whether she survived what had been built to. The first 18 hours were the quietest. That was the thing nobody would understand later. How still everything was before it broke open. Imani back in the hotel room. Catherine working phones in Chicago and Atlanta simultaneously, her voice carrying through their calls with the clipped efficiency of someone who has stopped sleeping because sleep is a resource she can no longer afford. Elias moving through his contact list with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that every call he made was a door he was opening that could not be closed again. Imani sat at the desk and built the presentation. That was what she called it in her head. Not a case, not a strategy, not a plan. A presentation, because the word carried the specific meaning she needed. She had spent 12 years sitting across tables from people who held power and persuading them of things. She knew how to structure information so that the person receiving it had no room to argue with the sequence. She knew how to order a room before she walked into it. She worked for 18 hours almost without stopping. She ate half a sandwich Catherine's assistant sent up. She drank coffee she stopped tasting somewhere around hour 7. She printed documents at the hotel business center at 2 in the morning, wearing a baseball cap she'd bought at a CVS, paid cash, kept her head angled away from the cameras. Not because it would fool anyone serious, but because it bought a margin of ambiguity she might need. She built the presentation and she rehearsed it in the mirror of the hotel bathroom at 4 in the morning, speaking quietly so the rooms on either side wouldn't hear, watching her own face for the places where the emotion showed through and learning to close those places without making herself look like a machine, because a machine wouldn't move anyone and she needed to move a room full of people who had spent their careers not being moved. At the 30-hour mark, Elias called. 8 confirmed, he said. 3 more who said they'll be there but won't commit until they walk through the door. That's enough, she said. Imani. He paused. 2 of the 8 are people Jae-min considers loyal. They may be there to report back. I know, she said. That doesn't concern you? It means when he hears what I showed the room, he'll hear it accurately. She looked at the document spread across the desk. I don't need secrecy anymore, Elias. I need witnesses. A long pause on his end. Then, all right. The location is still secure? My contact's conference facility in Midtown. Jae-min has no relationship with the building. I've used it twice in the last 10 years for sensitive client meetings, and he's never asked about it. Good. 72 hours from when I called Catherine. She checked the time. That's tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. I'll confirm with everyone. She hung up and went back to the presentation. At hour 44, Jae-min's attorney called Catherine. Catherine called Imani 30 seconds later. They know you're not sitting still, Catherine said. Her voice was taut. His attorney called to inform me that they're filing a motion to compel compliance with the initial settlement offer and are simultaneously notifying the court of potential asset concealment by you. Asset concealment, Imani said. It's a preemptive strike. If they file it first, they frame you as the hiding party. It muddies the picture before you've had a chance to present your picture. Can they do it in time to affect anything before tomorrow night? Not if I file a counter motion in the next 4 hours. Catherine's voice was precise. Which I am about to do. But Imani, his attorney also said something else. Off the record, the way things get said off the record when they want you to know something without it being attributable. What? He said that his client is aware you've been reaching out to members of the organization and that his client considers this a hostile action with serious personal consequences. The room went quiet in a specific way. Serious personal consequences, Imani repeated. Yes. She thought about what that meant coming from Kang Jae-min's attorney in the context of what Kang Jae-min was. She thought about it very clearly and very specifically, without euphemism, because euphemism was a way of not taking something seriously that deserved to be taken seriously. File the motion, she said. And Catherine, call the contact at the FBI field office. The one you mentioned before. I think it's time we stopped keeping them at arm's length. A sharp intake of breath on Catherine's end. If we bring in federal investigators before tomorrow night, we lose control of the timeline completely. We bring them in as a parallel conversation, Imani said. Not the primary move. The primary move is tomorrow. But I want someone in that building who knows what's happening in case Jae-min decides that serious personal consequences mean something more direct than a legal threat. Silence. Okay, Catherine said. Okay, I'll make the call. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the hotel bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time since she'd walked into that bedroom and found them, feel the full weight of it. Not just the betrayal, not just the frame, not just the legal exposure, all of it, the entire accumulated mass of it, 14 months and 12 years and 20 years of a friendship. The painting gone from the wall, her mother's photograph removed from the house. The way Jae-min had held the envelope with the practiced ease of a man who'd rehearsed the moment so many times it had stopped feeling real to him. She let herself feel it because she'd learned over years that the feelings you lock out don't disappear. They accumulate pressure behind the seal, and they always find a way through, and they always find the worst possible moment to do it. Better to let them move through you in a hotel room at 5 in the morning when the only consequence is a wet pillowcase than to have them surface tomorrow night in front of 8 people whose decision about which way to lean would determine the next 10 years of her life. She cried for 20 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, and went back to the desk. By 9 the following evening, she was standing outside an unremarkable office building in Midtown Atlanta, in a charcoal gray suit she'd had Catherine's assistant pick up from a tailor in Buckhead. Not the most expensive thing she owned, not the most impressive, but precise, clean, completely controlled. Her heels on the marble lobby floor made a sound she'd always found steadying. Rhythm. Intention. The conference room was on the 14th floor. When she walked in, there were 11 people seated around the table. She'd expected 8 confirmed and 3 possibles. 11 meant someone had brought an extra, which meant the word had traveled further than Elias's calls, which meant that whatever Jae-min had been doing, more people had been watching it than he knew. She scanned the room in the time it took her to walk from the door to the head of the table. Marcus Webb, who ran the legitimate transportation division and had worked with the organization for 9 years. Donna Kong, no relation to Jae-min, who oversaw the property management subsidiaries. 3 faces she recognized from various financial and legal contexts over the years. 2 faces she didn't recognize at all, which meant they were either the ones Elias had warned her about, or they were the ones who'd heard and come on their own, and she'd find out which in the next hour. Elias himself, at the far end of the table, looking like a man who has committed completely to something and is past the point of second-guessing it. She did not see Jae-min. She'd calculated a 30% chance he'd try to walk in. She'd prepared for it. The fact that he hadn't meant either that he didn't know the specifics of the gathering or that he'd decided to let it play out, which would be a mistake on his part, but Jae-min had been making mistakes lately, and she'd stopped being surprised by them. She set her laptop on the table and connected it to the projector cable without looking up. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'm going to be direct with you because we don't have time for anything else. And because you are all adults who have spent your careers making decisions based on information rather than performance." She looked up. 11 faces. Careful, neutral, watchful. "What I'm about to show you will take approximately 40 minutes. I'll ask you to hold your questions until I'm finished. After that, you can ask me anything." Nobody said anything. Nobody left. She started the presentation. She'd built it to move like water, starting with what everyone in the room already knew or suspected, building toward what most of them didn't know, and ending at the place she needed them to arrive. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. The specific clarity of people who understand they are standing on ground that is less stable than they thought and need to decide very quickly whether to move. 15 minutes in, she heard the first shift in the room. Not a sound exactly, a change in the quality of the attention. The collective stillness that happens when people stop waiting to be convinced and start recognizing something they'd been half seeing for months. 25 minutes in, Marcus Webb leaned forward with his elbows on the table and his jaw set in a way that meant he was either about to walk out or about to commit, and she knew which one it was before he spoke. "The Pacific Holdings transfers," he said. "I flagged a discrepancy in those accounts 8 months ago. I was told it was under review." "It was under review by the people who created it," Imani said. He sat back. He didn't say anything else, but his face did. 32 minutes in, one of the 2 faces she didn't recognize stood up. He was a compact man, mid-50s, with the posture of someone accustomed to being the one who ended conversations. "I need to make a call," he said. The room's attention shifted to him. "Sit down," Imani said. He looked at her. The look was a specific kind of look, the kind that expects the person on the receiving end to flinch or qualify or soften what they said. She didn't. "Sit down," she said again. "You can make your call when I'm finished. If you walk out that door before I'm finished, every person in this room will know which side of this you chose, and so will the federal investigators who are currently holding a parallel conversation with my attorney." He sat down. 3 people at the table reacted to the word federal. She'd expected that. She'd put it there deliberately, not as a threat but as a fact, because facts land differently than threats in rooms full of people who've been managing exposure their whole careers. She finished the presentation. When the last slide came up, The shell company documentation, Caldwell Strategic Partners, her name on 14 months of fabricated transactions. The room was completely silent. Then Donna Kong said very quietly, "He put it in your name." "Yes," Imani said. "So if the investigation broke through, I would be the origin point," Imani said. "He would be the victim. The organization would be the injured party. And the divorce would be the story everyone remembered while the actual story finished playing out somewhere nobody was looking." Donna Kang looked at the screen, then at Imani, then at the table, with the expression of a woman doing math and not liking the answer. "What do you need from us?" she asked. The room was still going. Questions, pushback, two people talking over each other about asset protection and jurisdictional exposure. When Imani's phone buzzed on the table in front of her. A text from Catherine. "He knows. Leaving the estate now, 20 minutes out." Imani read it without changing her expression. She set the phone face down on the table. She let the conversation in the room run for exactly 3 more minutes, enough for the people who were going to commit to show it, enough for the ones who weren't to have made their choice visible. And then she said, clearly enough to cut through the noise, "He's coming." The room went quiet again. Jae-min knows this meeting is happening. He'll be here in approximately 15 minutes. She looked at each face in turn. "Anyone who wants to leave before he arrives can leave now. I won't hold it against you, and I won't name you in anything." She paused. "But if you stay, I need you to understand that what happens in this room in the next hour is the thing that determines where every person at this table ends up when this is finished." Nobody moved. Not the people she knew. Not the 2 she didn't. Not the man who'd stood up and then sat down. 11 people stayed in their chairs, and the room held that stillness that belongs to a moment when a lot of separate calculations have all arrived at the same answer. He came through the door at 9:47. He was alone, which surprised her. She'd expected at least one person with him, a lawyer or a lieutenant, but Jae-min walked in alone and she understood immediately why. He'd come to talk her down. He thought this was still a conversation between 2 people. Still a negotiation. Still a situation where his presence was the heaviest thing in the room and her position was the weakest. He walked in and he saw the room and he stopped. Not dramatically, just a fractional pause. The involuntary hesitation of a body registering that the situation is not what it expected. His eyes moved across the 11 faces, landing and moving on, and then they found Imani at the head of the table. She was sitting. She didn't stand when he entered. She looked at him over the heads of everyone between them with an expression she'd practiced in the hotel bathroom mirror at 4 in the morning and had finally found, not hostile, not triumphant, simply present, simply there. "Jae-min," she said, "come in." He came in. He didn't sit. He stood at the far end of the table near the door, and he looked at the screen behind her where the last slide was still displayed. Her name, his company structure, 14 months of fabricated history. And something moved through his face that she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not the cold authority she'd watched him use in rooms for 12 years. Calculation. Rapid, urgent calculation. A man looking at a board position he'd assumed was controlled and discovering it had been changed while he wasn't watching. "Imani." His voice was level. "This isn't what you think it is." "Tell me what it is," she said. "It's complicated. The company structure, the accounts. There are legitimate reasons for what are the legitimate reasons for 14 months of transactions connecting a company in my name to entities associated with David Choi's network," she said. "I'd genuinely like to hear them." The room was not breathing. Jaemin's jaw tightened. She'd seen that jaw tighten 1,000 times. She knew every way it moved. She knew the one that meant he was angry, and the one that meant he was afraid, and the one that meant he was deciding whether to push or to retreat. This was the last one. "We should talk about this privately," he said. "No," she said. "Imani, no." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You made this a room full of people when you started moving money through structures that affect everyone in this building. You made it a room full of people when you started selling operational information that puts everyone in this organization at risk. You made it a room full of people when you built a paper company in my name to use as a liability shield when the structure you were building came apart." She placed her hands flat on the table in front of her. "So we're going to talk about it in a room full of people." His eyes moved around the table again. Marcus Webb was looking at the screen. Donna Kang was looking at Jae-min. The man who'd stood up and sat down was looking at his hands. Jae-min looked back at Imani. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. His voice had dropped, gone quiet, in the way voices go quiet when a person is done with performance and down to something real. "Tell me," she said again. "The Choi situation." He stopped. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the table. "You think this is about money. It's not about money. Then what is it about?" "Survival." He said the word with a flatness that made the hair on Imani's arms rise, because it was the first thing he'd said since walking through the door that she believed completely. Choi was going to move against the organization, not negotiate, not compete, move against it. And I made a decision to get ahead of that by building a relationship before he decided we were an obstacle. By selling him our operational information, Imani said. By giving him enough to know we weren't hiding anything. By building trust. "And the company in my name?" His jaw moved. "Insurance." "Insurance," she repeated. If Choi decided the trust was insufficient, if the arrangement collapsed, I needed something to hand over that wasn't the actual organization. A misdirection. "Me," Imani said. "You needed to be able to hand me over." He didn't answer. "That's what the company was for," she said. "If David Choi decided your arrangement wasn't working, you were going to point him at a paper company in my name and give him a woman to blame while you walked away clean." The room was so silent she could hear the building's ventilation system. "You were going to use me as a decoy," she said, "for a criminal organization." "It would never have gotten that far," he said, and there was something in his voice that might, in a different room in a different 12 years, have sounded like conviction. Here it sounded like a man explaining why the fire he set wasn't really that dangerous. "But it might have," she said, "and you built the structure for it anyway. 14 months of building it." He looked at her, and for a moment, a single moment, the length of a breath, she saw something cross his face that she hadn't seen in a very long time. Not remorse exactly. The acknowledgement of something. The brief, brutal self-awareness of a person who has held a belief about who they are and has just seen evidence that the belief was constructed. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was something harder and more familiar. "The GBI is already looking at it," he said. "You've been talking to federal people. Catherine Park has been making calls. You think you're controlling this, but you're about to pull everyone in this room into a federal investigation, and when that happens, there's no version of this that ends well for Marcus." Imani didn't look away from Jae-min. She spoke to Marcus Webb without turning her head. "The documentation package I sent to your secure email this afternoon. Does it include what I told you it includes?" A pause. Then Marcus's voice, steady and deliberate. "Yes." "And the governance protocols I outlined for the legitimate subsidiaries, the independent oversight structure. My legal team reviewed it this afternoon. It's executable within 48 hours if the principal authority is transferred." Jaemin's head turned toward Marcus. Marcus met his eyes without looking away. "You," Jae-min started. "I've been with this organization for 9 years, Marcus said. "My name is on buildings in this city. My employees have families," he paused. "You were going to use the woman who built half of what we are as bait for David Choi." The room moved. Not physically. Something in the alignment of it. The way 11 people had been sitting in a specific kind of watchful neutrality and were now sitting in something else. Jae-min felt it. She watched him feel it. Watched his body register the shift the way a body registers a change in pressure, a slight unconscious tightening, a recalibration. He turned back to Imani. "What do you want?" he said. Not "this is over," or "you've made your point," or any of the other versions of the same retreat she might have heard from a man who had more left to bargain with. Just, "What do you want?" The question of a man who has just understood that the pieces he thought were still on his side of the board have changed position. She reached into the folder in front of her and took out a single document. She slid it across the table. He looked at it without picking it up. "Signed divorce papers," she said. "The ones your attorney prepared. Your settlement offer. Your terms. Everything you originally put in that envelope." She paused. "I'm not counteroffering. I'm not negotiating. I'm signing what you asked me to sign." He stared at the document. "That's it?" His voice was careful in the way voices get when a person suspects a trap but can't see where it is. "The corporate governance transfer is separate," she said. That's not a divorce matter. That's a structural matter. And Marcus and Donna are going to handle it through the independent oversight process with Catherine's guidance. She looked at him steadily. You wanted me out of your life. I'm giving you that. You wanted the divorce on your terms. I'm giving you that too. He still hadn't picked up the document. And the GBI investigation, he said, is proceeding independently of anything I control, she said. The evidence package my attorney holds will be made available to investigators if they request it. I'm not weaponizing it. I'm not withholding it. It exists, and they will determine what to do with it. He looked at her. She looked at him. And she watched him understand, finally, what she'd done. Not what she was threatening to do. What she had already done. The governance documentation in Marcus's email. The federal contact Catherine had made. The 11 people in this room who had just heard everything. The evidence that existed in multiple secure locations that she did not control and could not pull back even if she wanted to. She hadn't built a trap. She had built something that didn't need to trap him because it had already removed him from the board. He picked up the document. He looked at it for a long time. The room held its breath. Then he looked up at her and she saw it. The thing she'd wondered privately in the small hours in the hotel room whether she would see. The thing she wasn't sure she wanted to see and wasn't sure she didn't. The specific, irretrievable recognition of a man who has arrived at the moment where he understands the full scale of his miscalculation. He had thought she was a woman who would take the pain and leave. He had built 14 months of architecture on that assumption, and the assumption had been wrong in every direction. You had this from the beginning, he said. Not accusatory, stunned, the voice of a man doing the math in real time. The early return, He stopped. You came home early. I was tired, she said. You found us and you didn't. He was working through it. She could see him working through it. You didn't react. You said that line and you left. You thought I was devastated, she said. You were, he said. And then, unexpectedly, something in his voice shifted. Weren't you? The room had gone entirely still. Imani looked at him across the length of the conference table, across 11 witnesses and 40 minutes of evidence and 14 months of a destruction he'd constructed in her name, and she said, yes. One word. He looked at her. I was, she said. But I've been building things in hard conditions my entire life, Jae-min. You knew that about me. You just didn't think it applied to this. He held the document for another moment. Then he set it back on the table. He reached into his jacket and took out a pen. He signed. He slid it back toward her and he stood there looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for and was not going to try to name. And then he turned and walked toward the door, and he was almost through it when Marcus Webb said, The Pacific Holdings accounts are frozen as of 6 o'clock this evening, per the independent oversight provisions. You'll receive documentation in the morning. Jae-min stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and Imani watched the line of his shoulders and the stillness of him, and she thought about 12 years, and she thought about her mother's photograph missing from the wall, and she thought about Vanessa's voice saying 8 months, and she thought about a painting in earth tones that had hung above a fireplace and been removed like it was nothing. He walked out. The door closed. The room held its breath for 2 full seconds, and then Marcus Webb exhaled and Donna Kang set her hands flat on the table and someone at the far end said something under their breath that Imani didn't catch. And the room came back to life around her in the specific, exhausted way of a room that has been holding tremendous tension and has just been released from it. Imani looked at the signed document in front of her. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She felt tired. A deep, structural tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the number of hours she'd spent holding herself at a specific tension, not letting anything give that couldn't afford to give, moving through the last 12 days on the knowledge that if she stopped being precise for even an hour, the whole construction would collapse and take her with it. And underneath the tiredness, something else. Not triumph, not relief. The particular quiet feeling of a woman who has just done the hardest thing she's ever done and is now standing on the other side of it, looking back at who she was before she had any reason to be this person, and understanding that you cannot go back to the person you were before the thing that made you this one. Catherine's name appeared on her phone screen. She answered. It's done, Imani said. A pause. Then Catherine's voice, controlled and professional and containing, just barely, something warmer underneath it. The signed document. He signed. He signed. And the room? Imani looked at the 11 people around the table, some of them already on phones, some of them talking quietly to each other. Marcus Webb looking at her with the expression of a man who has just decided something and is at peace with the decision. The room stayed, she said. Another pause. Imani, Catherine said, it's not over. The GBI, the Choi situation, the governance transfer. There's still, I know, she said, but tonight it's enough, Imani said. And her voice, for the first time in 12 days, carried something that was the signed document sat on the conference table for 11 minutes before Imani picked it up. She wasn't being dramatic about it. She simply had other things to do first. Marcus needed confirmation on the governance transfer timeline. Donna had a question about the Independent Oversight Board's authority during the transition period, and the man who had stood up and sat down came around the table and introduced himself as Victor Lim, Senior Operations Director for 3 of the Eastern subsidiaries, and told her with the directness of someone who has decided to stop hedging that he'd been watching the Pacific Holdings discrepancies for 6 months and hadn't known who to bring them to and was glad somebody finally had. She thanked him. She answered Marcus. She clarified Donna's question. She shook hands with people she knew and people she didn't, and by the time the room had emptied down to just her and Elias, the document had been sitting there for 11 minutes, and she finally folded it and put it in her bag without ceremony. Elias was putting on his coat. He was moving slowly, the way he moved at the end of long days, with the deliberateness of a body that had decided to conserve what was left. Go home, she told him. Sleep. I'll sleep when the governance transfer files are confirmed, he said. My nephew is standing by to... Elias. She looked at him. Go home. The files will be there in the morning. You will not be useful to anyone if you run yourself into the ground tonight. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he sometimes got, the one that was almost paternal without quite arriving there, the one that reminded her of the way her own father had looked at her when she'd done something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure whether to be proud or concerned. You did well tonight, he said. She nodded. She didn't have a response for that. That didn't feel like too much or too little. So she just nodded, and he seemed to understand, and he left. She stood alone in the conference room for a moment. The projector had auto shut off, and the screen was dark, and the table was empty except for 2 abandoned coffee cups and a legal pad. Someone had left behind. The room smelled like recycled air and the particular staleness of tension that has been present for a long time and has just dissipated. She picked up her laptop. She picked up her bag. She turned off the lights. On the way down in the elevator, she thought about Catherine, who was still working, who would be working until 2 or 3 in the morning because that was how Catherine operated. And she thought about sending a message but decided to call instead because the night felt too significant for text. Catherine answered on the second ring. The GBI contact, Imani said. What's the current status? They want a formal interview, Catherine said. I've scheduled it for Thursday morning. I'll be with you. We're going in with the full documentation package, the Caldwell Strategic Partners records, the access logs, the fabricated transaction history, all of it. And we are walking them through every piece of it before they ask a single question. We control the narrative from the first minute. And the Choi situation? The FBI field office contact has been briefed, separately from the GBI. The 2 investigations will cross at some point, and when they do, our documentation is already in both rooms. A pause. Imani, I want to be honest with you about what comes next. Be honest. This does not resolve quickly. Jae-min signed the divorce papers tonight, but the legal finalization takes time. The GBI investigation into the information breach will take time. The governance transition. Marcus and Donna are capable, but rebuilding legitimate structures that have been compromised from the inside takes months, not weeks. And there will be days in the next 6 months where it feels like none of it is moving and the whole thing might still fall apart. I know, Imani said. I just want to make sure you know what you've walked into. Catherine. Imani pushed through the building's front door and stepped out into the Atlanta night, and the heat hit her. The thick, pressing August heat that the city never quite shed even after dark. Heat that wrapped around you like something physical. I've known what I walked into since the moment I sat down with Elias, and he told me about the Pacific Holdings transfers. I don't need the road to be short. I just need it to be real. A pause. Then Catherine said with the closest thing to warmth Imani had ever heard from her, It's real. Then we're fine. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building with the city going on around her, cars and distant voices, and the particular energy of a weeknight in Midtown where everything is always slightly in motion. And she breathed in the hot night air and felt the exhaustion arrive fully now that she'd stopped fighting it back. 12 days since she'd walked through her front door. 12 days since the trucks and the missing painting, and Vanessa in her robe and the envelope slid across the table like a tip. She went back to the hotel. Thursday came. The GBI interview lasted 4 hours. Imani sat in a beige conference room across from Raymond Cho and a younger investigator named Teresa Walsh, who took notes with the quiet efficiency of someone who never looked up from the page. And she answered every question directly and completely, and pointed to the documentation for every answer so that nothing she said was unverifiable. Raymond Cho was a professional. He pushed where he needed to push, and he backed off when he hit something solid, and what he hit, every time, was documentation. The shell company, the forged signature analysis that Catherine had commissioned from a forensic document examiner, the access logs showing that the server entry bearing Imani's credentials had originated from a device and IP address she could demonstrate she'd never used, the timeline establishing that she had been in Seoul at the moment the account was opened. At the 2-hour mark, Teresa Walsh set down her pen and said, "Ms. Caldwell, I want to ask you something outside the formal record for a moment." Imani looked at Catherine. Catherine gave a minimal nod. "Go ahead," Imani said. "Did you know any of this was happening while it was happening?" Imani thought about the question. She took the time to actually think about it rather than answering quickly, because the quick answer and the true answer were different things, and she'd decided a long time ago that the true answer, whatever it cost, was the only one she could live with. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I didn't know the shape of it. I'd been traveling so much that I'd stopped looking at the things I should have been looking at, and I told myself it was trust, and I think part of it genuinely was, and part of it was that I didn't want to see what was there to be seen." Teresa Walsh wrote something. "Thank you for that," she said, and went back to the formal record. At the 4-hour mark, Raymond Cho closed his folder. He had a way of closing folders that communicated something. A careful, deliberate closure that meant the meeting was over and something had been decided. "We'll be in touch," he said. Catherine walked Imani out. In the parking garage, out of earshot of the building, she said, "Walsh is the lead investigator. Cho is her supervisor. The fact that she asked the off-record question means she believes you." "How sure are you?" 65%, Catherine said, which from Catherine Park was the equivalent of certainty. Imani got in the car. The call from Vanessa came on a Saturday morning, 12 days after the conference room. Imani was in a temporary apartment she'd rented in Virginia Highland, a 2-bedroom on the second floor of a building with a courtyard, chosen because it had nothing to do with any part of her previous life. And everything was chosen by her alone, every piece of furniture, every dish, the particular shade of curtain in the bedroom that was almost the same deep blue-green as the painting she'd commissioned and lost. She'd found a print, not the painting, obviously, a different artist, a different piece, but something in the same register, the same density of color, and she'd hung it the first week. She looked at it every morning. Vanessa called at 8:47. Imani looked at the name on the screen for a long moment. She picked up. "They arrested him last night." Vanessa's voice was quiet. Not triumphant, not relieved. The voice of someone reporting a fact that carries too much history to feel like news. Jae-min, federal agents, at the estate. Imani sat down on the edge of the couch. She'd known it was coming. Catherine had warned her 48 hours earlier that the FBI field office was moving, and it would be soon. Knowing it was coming and hearing it said out loud were different experiences, and she sat with that difference for a moment. "David Choi was arrested in the same operation," Vanessa continued. "I saw it on the news this morning. They said it was related to an ongoing financial crimes investigation and unauthorized transfer of proprietary information." A pause. "They mentioned the name of the shell company, Caldwell Strategic Partners." "Yes," Imani said. "They said the company appeared to be fraudulently registered," Vanessa said, "that the named principal had no knowledge of its existence." "Yes." A long silence. "Is it over?" Vanessa asked. Imani thought about the question. She looked at the print on the wall. The deep color of it, the weight it gave the room. She thought about the governance transfer, which Marcus had confirmed was complete 3 days ago. The legitimate subsidiaries now operating under independent oversight. The employees who came in every morning not knowing how close the whole structure had come to collapsing on top of them. She thought about the divorce finalization, which Catherine had said would be complete within 60 days. She thought about Elias, who had called her the morning after the conference room meeting to tell her he was sleeping better than he had in 8 months. The legal part of it isn't over, she said. That'll take time. But the part where I didn't know what was being done to me and couldn't stop it, yes, that part is over. Another silence. Then Vanessa said, I'd like to have coffee. Sometime, not now. Whenever, if you ever want to. She stopped. I know you probably don't. Imani was quiet. She thought about 20 years. She thought about the Sunday morning phone calls and the trip to Savannah and the coffee cups they'd bought at the market and the silk robe and the 8 months and the server credentials and all the ways a person can be someone you trusted with your life right up until the moment they're not. I don't know if I'll want to, she said. I can't tell you that I will. I know. Vanessa's voice was very small. But I also can't tell you I won't, Imani said, because I don't know yet who I'm going to be in 2 years, and I'd rather not make permanent decisions from where I'm standing right now. A sound on the other end that might have been Vanessa exhaling or might have been something closer to crying, controlled. Okay, Vanessa said. Okay. She hung up. She sat on the edge of the couch with the phone in her lap and the morning light coming through the window and the print on the wall across from her, and she thought about forgiveness. Not the version of forgiveness that means everything goes back to how it was, which she'd understood for years was not a real thing, but the other version. The one that has nothing to do with the person you're forgiving and everything to do with whether you can set down the weight of it and still be yourself without it. She didn't know yet whether she'd arrive there with Vanessa. She knew she was walking in that direction. That was enough for a Saturday morning. 3 weeks later, Elias called and asked if she would come to the house for dinner. Not for business. His words, not for business. Which was unusual enough that she agreed without asking further questions. She arrived at 6. His nephew was there, a young man named Daniel who had configured the encrypted server and who turned out to be 24 years old with the careful politeness of someone raised to respect people considerably older than himself. Elias had actually cooked, not ordered, a meal his wife had apparently made every Friday for the first 30 years of their marriage, a specific braised short rib that took most of the day and filled the house with a smell that landed somewhere in the body before it landed in the mind. They ate in the dining room, which Elias usually kept closed, and he brought out the good dishes without ceremony or comment. Halfway through the meal, Daniel said to Imani, "My uncle told me what you did." "Daniel," Elias said, in the tone of someone who has asked for restraint and is not receiving it. "Not all of it," Daniel said, "just the general shape." He looked at Imani with the open curiosity of someone young enough to still find the actions of other people genuinely interesting rather than competitive. "Were you scared?" Imani considered the question with the same care she'd given Teresa Walsh's question in the GBI interview. "Yes," she said. "The whole time." Different kinds of scared at different points. She picked up her fork. "At the beginning, I was scared of what I was going to find out. In the middle, I was scared of running out of time. Toward the end, I was mostly scared of making a mistake that cost someone else something they hadn't signed up to lose. But not scared of him?" She thought about Jae-min in the conference room doorway, seeing the room and doing the rapid calculation, the jaw tightening, the voice dropping to something real for the first time in the conversation. She thought about the 14 months and the envelope and the painting gone from the wall. "I was scared of him," she said. "I just didn't let that be the loudest thing." Daniel nodded slowly, like someone filing information away. Elias looked at her across the table with the expression that was almost paternal, and then he raised his glass. Just water, the bourbon long gone back to wherever he'd returned it, and he said, "To my wife, who always told me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everything is going well." Imani raised her glass. Daniel raised his. They drank. She went to the estate in October. Not for any legal reason. The divorce was finalized in September. The property had been dealt with through Catherine's office in a negotiation that Jae-min's new attorneys had conducted with notably less confidence than the original settlement had suggested. The estate itself was in a holding status, neither sold nor transferred yet, sitting in the particular administrative limbo that follows the kind of collapse that Jae-min's had been. Imani had one authorized visit permitted for personal property retrieval. She'd scheduled it for a Tuesday morning because Tuesday mornings are ordinary and she wanted the day to be ordinary. She drove herself. She pulled through the gate and the courtyard was empty. No moving trucks this time, no men in gray uniforms carrying her belongings toward an open truck bed. Just the courtyard and the early October light and the trees that she'd planted along the eastern edge of the property 5 years ago because she'd wanted to see them grow, which they had, which they were doing regardless of everything else. She went inside. The house had been emptied further since she'd last been in it. Jae-min's attorneys had been through, she knew, and there were legal seals on certain rooms and a quietness that comes from a building being no longer inhabited, no longer a home, just a structure. She walked through the foyer, past the sitting room, past the kitchen entrance, past the study, where she stopped. The wall was still bare where the painting had been. She'd expected that. She'd spent a small amount of time before this visit making peace with the specific things she was not going to find, and the painting was first on that list. It was gone, wherever it had gone. Sold or stored or simply moved to wherever things go when a life dismantles. She'd looked into finding another piece by the same New Orleans artist and discovered the woman was still working, still making things in deep earth tones and burnt sienna and that particular almost black that wasn't quite blue, and had reached out through the gallery that represented her. There was a new piece in progress. She'd put a deposit down. She stood in the doorway of the study for a moment, looking at the bare wall, and she let herself feel the loss of it cleanly. Not with the layered complication of everything it had come to represent, but simply as itself, a beautiful thing that was gone, and that was a loss worth acknowledging even when it wasn't the biggest one. Then she went upstairs. She'd told herself she wasn't going to go into the master bedroom. She had no reason to be in there. What she'd come for was her mother's photograph, and she'd last seen it in the sitting room off the master, not the bedroom itself. She could retrieve it without going through the door. She went through the door anyway. The room was empty. Not staged empty, not prepared empty. Simply stripped, the way rooms get when everything that made them specific to a person has been removed and what remains is just the architecture. The window looked out over the back gardens, where the roses she'd planted in the first year were still growing in ragged, untended October fullness, because nobody had been maintaining them, and roses, it turned out, will continue to grow regardless of whether anyone is paying attention to them. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room where she'd found them, and she did the things she'd been doing for the last 3 months, whenever she encountered the residue of the life she'd been living before she understood what it was. She let it be what it was, without making it smaller than it deserved, and without letting it be larger than she could hold. It had been a real marriage, not entirely fabricated, not a performance from the beginning. She didn't believe that, and she wasn't going to construct a simpler history than the one she'd actually lived. There had been years that were good, genuinely good, before the machinery of Jae-min's ambition had begun consuming everything around it, including them. She didn't know exactly when it had changed or whether it had changed in him or whether it had always been there beneath the surface of everything, and she had simply not been willing to look. It didn't entirely matter. What mattered was that she knew now, and she was standing in this room with that knowledge, and she was standing upright. She turned and left the bedroom and did not look back. The sitting room off the master still had a few pieces in it. Minor furniture, a floor lamp, items that hadn't been prioritized in the clearing, and on the wall beside the window, slightly crooked from when something had been stacked against it during the earlier clear-out, was her mother's photograph. She'd had it framed years ago. A simple dark frame, the photograph itself black and white, taken sometime in the early 1980s. Her mother, at about 30 years old, standing in front of a building Imani had never been able to identify, laughing at something outside the frame. Not posed, not arranged. Just a woman in the middle of laughing, caught by someone with a camera who'd had the sense to press the button at the right moment. Imani took it off the wall. She straightened it in her hands. She looked at her mother's face, the particular quality of that laugh, which Imani had inherited in the bone structure, if not always in the ease of it. She carried the photograph downstairs, through the foyer, through the front door. Outside, the October morning was doing something particular that October mornings do in Atlanta. The light coming at a low angle through the trees she'd planted, the air cooler than it had any right to be after summer, the sky a sharp, unrepeatable blue. She stood on the front steps with her mother's photograph, and she looked at the courtyard and the gate and the trees, and she breathed in the cool air, and she let the estate be what it was, a place she had lived, a place that had held a version of her life, a place she was leaving. She walked to the car. She put the photograph on the passenger seat, propped against the door so her mother's laughing face was visible, and she got in and she drove out through the gate. She didn't stop at this gate. She didn't slow down to look back. She drove through it the way you drive through any gate when you know where you're going, which is without looking back, because what's behind you is behind you and the road in front requires the attention. In November, she took a meeting with a woman named June Park, no relation to Catherine, who was the director of a community development foundation operating in several Atlanta neighborhoods, and who had reached out through Marcus Webb's office to ask if Imani would consider joining the foundation's advisory board. Imani sat across from June Park in a coffee shop in Ponce Highland and drank actual good coffee and listened to what the foundation did and what they needed, and she asked questions for 40 minutes and answered questions for 20. And at the end of the hour, June Park looked at her and said, "I want to be transparent about something." "Please," Imani said. "Some of our donors knew your husband." June Park said it directly, without softening. "When I told the board I was reaching out to you, there was some concern about the association." "I understand," Imani said. "I told them that the association between your name and what happened with his organization is exactly why I wanted you involved." June looked at her steadily, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the specific patience of someone who has been doing important work without recognition for a long time and has made a kind of peace with that. "You understand how power moves and who it leaves behind when it moves badly. We need that." Imani looked at her coffee cup. She thought about Marcus Webb saying my employees have families in the conference room. She thought about Elias and his orchid and his good dishes. She thought about Vanessa's voice saying, "I gave up 20 years of friendship with nothing left to protect or perform for." She thought about what Elias had said his wife always told him, about the measure of a person. "I'll join the board," she said. June Park smiled for the first time in the meeting. She had a good smile, the kind that didn't ask anything from you. "Good," she said, and refilled Imani's coffee. The legal pieces settled across a stretch of months that was, as Catherine had promised, neither fast nor simple. The GBI investigation into the information breach concluded with charges filed against 3 individuals, none of them Imani, all of them traceable through the documentation she and Elias and Catherine had assembled. The Caldwell Strategic Partners LLC was formally identified as a fraudulent construction, its records entered into the federal evidentiary record, its existence used in the prosecution in ways that took the company Imani had never heard of and made it, finally, useful. Jae-min's federal case was complex in the way cases are complex when a person has spent years building complexity as protection and fines. At the end, that the complexity is what takes the longest to untangle. Catherine kept Imani informed at regular intervals without overwhelming her with detail, because they'd reached an understanding early on that Imani needed to be informed without being consumed. The case against Jae-min was strong. It would take time. It would take time regardless of how strong it was, because that was how these things worked, and Imani had accepted that and built her life accordingly. The legitimate subsidiaries, under Marcus and Donna's oversight and the independent governance structure, stabilized. The employees kept their jobs. 3 of the organizations actually grew in the 12 months following the transition, partly because the removal of the corrupt overhead that had been quietly draining them turned out to have an immediate and measurable effect on operating margins, and partly because Marcus Webb was, it emerged, a genuinely excellent operations director who had been working slightly below his capacity for years because the environment hadn't rewarded operating at full capacity. Imani wasn't involved in the subsidiaries. She'd removed herself from the structure completely, as she'd said she would, and she watched their progress from a distance with the particular satisfaction of watching something you helped protect continue to function. Elias retired formally in the spring. He threw a small party at his house, the good dishes again, and Daniel flew in from New York, where he'd taken a job at a firm that built encryption systems for financial institutions. And Imani brought a bottle of wine she'd been saving, and they ate in the dining room and talked until late. At one point, Elias pulled out the chessboard, and he and Daniel played, and Imani watched. And she noticed, as she'd noticed before, that Elias played badly for about the first 10 minutes of every game, loose, inattentive, as if warming up. And then at some point shifted and became an entirely different caliber of player, methodical and patient, and a great deal harder to beat than the first 10 minutes had suggested. She'd asked him about that once, years ago. He'd said his wife had told him he did it unconsciously, that he'd learned early in his career that in certain rooms, being underestimated was a resource. She understood that now in her body, in a way she hadn't then. The new painting arrived in April. The New Orleans artist. Her name was Sable, just Sable, the way certain artists discard surnames as a professional decision, had completed the commission piece and shipped it carefully in custom crating, and Imani spent an afternoon with the level and a measuring tape and a willingness to move it several times until it was right, and hung it in the living room of the Virginia Highland apartment in the spot she'd been leaving empty for it since November. She stepped back and looked at it. It was not the same as the piece that had hung in the estate. She hadn't asked for the same. She'd told Sable only the general direction, the earth tones, the density, the particular quality of dark that lived inside it, and left the rest to someone who understood those colors better than she did. What arrived was different in its specific shapes and arrangements, but the same in the way that mattered. It gave the room an anchor. It gave her something to look at in the morning that asked nothing of her and simply was what it was. She looked at it for a while. Then she went to make coffee. The morning she went to clear out the last of her things from a storage unit she'd been paying for since the hotel weeks. A unit containing items she'd retrieved from the estate before everything was formally sorted. She found, at the back behind 3 boxes she'd packed in a hurry and hadn't opened since, a book she'd forgotten she owned. It was a small thing. A collection of essays she'd bought in a used bookshop in London on a layover, years ago, carried it home, read the first 2 essays, set it down, meaning to return to it, and apparently had never returned to it. She'd packed it out of the master bedroom's reading stack without registering what it was, and here it was now, creased at the cover, the pages faintly yellowed at the edges, the way paperbacks yellow when they've been sitting in a space without enough air circulation. She stood in the fluorescent light of the storage unit and flipped it open to the first essay she'd apparently stopped at, marked with a boarding pass stub from a flight she couldn't remember taking. She didn't read the essay. She just looked at the boarding pass and the slightly yellowed page, and the way the essay began mid-argument, the way essays do, with the assumption that you were already curious before you arrived. She put the book in the box she was keeping. She loaded everything into the car. She drove back through the city in the particular gold of a spring morning, the light doing what it always did in Atlanta in April, arriving sideways and generous, making everything look slightly more significant than it had a right to, making the ordinary streets and the ordinary buildings and the ordinary people walking dogs and carrying coffee look, briefly, like the establishing shot of something important. She had a board meeting at 11. She had lunch with Catherine at 1, not about business, just lunch, because they'd discovered somewhere in the last several months that they actually liked each other outside the context of crisis, which had surprised them both slightly. She had a call with Elias at 4, which would last 45 minutes and range across 3 subjects before settling on chess strategy, which was where his mind went when it was relaxed. In the evening, she had nothing scheduled. She would go home. She would make dinner with the specific competence of someone who has learned to cook for herself after years of shared kitchens, which is different from cooking for company in ways she was still discovering. She would sit in the living room where the new painting hung, and she would read or she wouldn't, and the evening would be hers in the way evenings become yours when no one else has a claim on how you move through them. She stopped at a light on Ponce de Leon and looked out the window at the city going about its morning, and she thought, not with triumph, not with bitterness, just with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has been through a thing and is on the other side of it. She thought about the woman who had stood in a hotel room 3 months ago and cried for 20 minutes and then washed her face and gone back to work. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself at that moment, that she was building something in order to survive, that every move was a response to something done to her, that the structure she was constructing was defensive in its nature, built to withstand a threat. She understood now that this was only partly true. Yes, she had been defending herself. Yes, the threat had been real and the defense had been necessary. But she hadn't just defended herself. She had found out, in the particular crucible of the last several months, what she was actually made of. Not the polished professional self she maintained in boardrooms, not the composed wife she'd performed in the estate's public rooms, but the actual essential thing underneath all of that. The part that Jae-min had looked at and decided was replaceable and disposable and had been catastrophically wrong about. She had found out that underneath everything, she was someone who knew how to hold a room full of people in a moment of uncertainty and give them something steady to orient toward. She had found out that she could grieve and work simultaneously, which she'd doubted before. She had found out that an elder man with good dishes and a dead wife's orchid and a nephew who built encryption systems could be the most important person in a crisis. She had found out that the hardest thing was not the confrontation. The confrontation was, in the end, just a room and a document and 11 people who chose to stay. The hardest thing was the period before the confrontation, in the hotel room, in the long hours of careful assembly, in the daily decision to keep going with precision instead of panic. She had found out that she was capable of that. The light changed. She drove through it. Behind her, the city did what the city always does, continued, regardless, in all directions. People moved through it carrying their own accumulated weights, and their own unresolved questions, and their own versions of the thing Imani had survived, each one in a different shape, each one requiring a different response, each one landing on a different person with varying degrees of preparation. She thought about what she would say to someone at the beginning of the thing she'd just been through, if she could say anything. She didn't arrive at a clean answer. There wasn't one. The honest thing was too particular to her own situation, too dependent on the specific inventory of what she'd already known and who was already in her corner and where the weakness in the structure was, to be useful as general advice. The closest she could get was this, that the silence was not weakness, that she had been quiet at the beginning because she was watching, and that people had interpreted her quiet as defeat, and that this was the most significant miscalculation anyone had made about her. You can be in pain and precise at the same time. You can be grieving and building at the same time. You can be, in the same moment, both the most hurt you have ever been and the most capable you have ever been, and these things do not cancel each other out. Jae-min had looked at her silence and seen surrender. It was the last mistake he made as a man who believed he understood her. She pulled into the parking garage under her building. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the car with her hands in her lap and her mother's photograph still riding on the passenger seat, still propped against the door, her mother's face still mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Whatever it was her mother had been laughing at, all those years ago in the black and white morning of 1981 or 1982 or whenever it had been. Whatever had caught her off guard and pulled that laugh out of her before she could arrange her face, it must have been something good. Imani picked up the photograph. She looked at her mother's face. "I know," she said quietly, to no one and the photograph both. Then she got out of the car, and she walked toward the morning, and the city held her the way cities hold everyone, impersonally, enormously, without judgment. And she moved through it with her back straight and her step measured, and the weight of everything she'd been carrying distributed properly across her shoulders, which had always been strong enough. She had always been strong enough. She'd just had to find out for certain. And